We're really excited to have this incredibly important conversation with you today about Tacoma's housing crisis. And with me today, I'm really excited to introduce our two panelists. We have Michaela Lemons and Dr. Ali Modares. And before we jump into things, I just want to take a moment and tell you a quick little bit about each of them. Michaela is the Prevention and Health Coordinator focused on African American women at the Pierce County AIDS Foundation. And she serves as the chair of the Human Rights Commission for the city of Tacoma, as well as on the board of the Hilltop Action Coalition. She graduated right here from UW-T in 2016 with a bachelor's in criminal justice and psychology, and is attending Seattle U working on her master's in public administration. So Michaela, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to talk with you about this. And joining her is Ali Modares, the Dean and Professor for the School of Urban Studies at UW-T. So we have a really strong UW-T contingent here today. Ali is the Dean and the Assistant Chancellor for Community Engagement at UW-T. And in addition to that, for basically the past 20 years, up until a few years ago, he served as the editor-in-chief of Cities, the International Journal of Urban Policy and Planning. So Dr. Modares is a huge asset to our community and really integral to the conversations that we're having about the housing crisis. So in terms of the housing crisis, I just really want to start by saying we are facing a multidimensional housing crisis here in Tacoma right now. And what I mean by that is we talk about it in different ways because there are a lot of different things that are happening right now. For example, we have an affordable housing crisis here in Tacoma right now, which means that there are not enough units of affordable housing to support the residents and the incomes that we have currently in the city of Tacoma. But it's not just affordable housing that we face a crisis with. It's also a crisis in terms of the availability and attainability of housing across all income levels. So for those of you that may already be homeowners, hopefully you got into the market a couple of years ago, because it's getting harder and harder to afford being able to even enter the housing market in Tacoma, no matter what your income is. And we're going to talk more about why that is and some of the data behind that. But I say that just to say the crisis is not one-dimensional. It's not just about affordable units of housing. It's about really attainable housing across all income levels for all residents in Tacoma. I am lucky enough to serve at the city of Tacoma. I should introduce myself as well. Apologies. My name is Jacques Colon. I'm the Tacoma 2025 Strategic Manager for the city. I have the privilege of working with Kenny and many others at the city of Tacoma. And one of the projects that I work on is the Affordable Housing Action Strategy. And the Affordable Housing Action Strategy is a set of about 24 different objectives, looking at all of the different ways that we can support creating more attainable housing in the city of Tacoma by doing four things: creating more units of housing, preserving existing units of affordable housing, helping people that are currently facing a housing crisis, and reducing barriers for people who often experience them. And like I said, that this is not a one-dimensional crisis. All four of those objectives require many different actions in order to really just to start to take a bite out of this crisis. And one of the projects that led to this conversation today is called the Home in Tacoma Project, which is really focused on how do we create more units of housing. And I'm gonna take just a minute before we go into the Home in Tacoma Project to ask Kenny do you think we're ready to close the poll and share those results, Kenny?
We are, Jacques, thank you. And just so everybody knows, we do have a Spanish interpreter here today. If you'd prefer to listen to today's panel in Spanish, you can click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. And this will be recorded and shared with people who prefer to listen in Spanish after the event as well. And here are our poll results. And just so you know, as the panel is going, you can also submit questions. We're going to be taking questions for our panel today. You can submit those questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You'll submit them in writing, and then I'm going to read them to our panelists when we get to the Q&A portion. I get to be the voice of the people today. All right, here are our results, Jacques. You can run through any of them that you want to, or just move into the panel.
Thank you, Kenny. So it looks like a fair number of people own when we're talking about housing situation, and a good number also rent. So we have about 66% that own and 34% that rent. It looks like about 68% spend less than 30% of their income on housing, and 32% spend more than 30%. You'll hear in a minute that that is not representative of the community, as we have a whole lot of people that are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And in terms of what people would like to change about their housing situation, it looks like the winner was lowering my housing costs. And in second place was becoming a homeowner, something that we see quite a bit. And what housing types would you prefer to live in? A lot of people prefer the detached single family home, but we have a lot of answers and respondents saying that townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, or fourplexes, and multifamily would all be their preferred housing types. And in terms of what challenges might prevent you from finding your ideal housing situations, again, home prices really rose to the top, and purchase prices were there at the top, with other barriers like not enough supply on the market and neighborhood choice out of reach also coming up as frequent choices. And finally, what actions do you all think the city should take to address housing needs? Well, looks like a lot of you want the city to take a lot of different actions: creating more homes for more people, keeping housing affordable and in good repair, helping people stay in their homes and their communities, and reducing barriers for people who often encounter them. All got more than 60% of respondents to answer for those. So thank you again for filling those questions out. Really interesting. So really quickly, before we jump into the panel discussion, I want to quickly share some information about the Home in Tacoma project, as well as where some of this crisis is being shown. So I'm going to show you just a couple of quick slides. And what you should see on your screen on the left is the Tacoma Equity Index. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Equity Index, it's a tool that allows us to show opportunity across a lot of different indicators across the city of Tacoma. And the darker colors show higher levels of opportunity, things like higher incomes, higher life expectancy, higher education, whereas the lighter colors show less opportunity in terms of lower incomes, lower life expectancy, and lower educational outcomes. So as you can see, there are very big differences across the city in terms of opportunity. Now, flipping over to the right side of your screen, that's our current zoning in the city of Tacoma. And those different colors represent different zoning designations that either allow or don't allow different types of construction and housing in different areas. And the thing that I really want to point out to you is the thing that probably catches your eye first, which is all of that light yellow, kind of that beige light yellow color that takes up the majority of the city of Tacoma zoning designation. And if you look in the key on the bottom left of that picture, you can see that that color represents our single family residential zoning, which means that in all of those areas, really the only housing that we can build are single family detached residential houses. Now, when we're talking about how do we deal with this housing crisis, we have to recognize that there's a very limited amount of housing that we're actually able to build and create when most of our city can only be built with those single family residential houses. So in addition to the fact that there are limited opportunities to build more housing because of that zoning, there's also a real impact on how many people are able to access areas of high opportunity. When we talk about creating an equitable city that works for everybody, we have to recognize that those high opportunity areas that you see in the equity index, again, showing that on the left side, those actually correlate very well with the areas of the highest home values, which you see on the right. And what that means is it's an incredibly high barrier for people to get over to even access those areas in terms of housing, right? You already have to have quite a bit of home equity or cash on hand to be able to get into those areas of high opportunity where you may have other opportunities afforded to you. And so what we're going to talk about today is the Home in Tacoma project's focus, which is how do we actually diversify the housing that we have in those single family residential zoned areas. And one of the ways that we can do that is by including what's called missing middle housing. And when we say missing middle housing, a lot of times what we think about when we talk about housing is either that typical single family home, or on the other end of the spectrum, big multifamily type of apartment complexes. But there are all these options in between that are typically not seen as often. And so when we talk about missing middle housing, what we're talking about is all these different options that you see on your screen right now. ADUs, duplexes and triplexes, townhouses, small multifamily, cottage housing, fourplexes, and each of these can look a lot of different ways. So when we talk about these other options, these other missing middle housing types, these are the housing types that we're going to be talking about. And the last thing I'll say is that this is not how the city has been zoned forever. A lot of these housing types were allowed in many neighborhoods, and you can probably see examples of them as you drive through different neighborhoods like Old Town. But in the 1950s, we decided as a city that we were going to change our zoning and make all of those areas single family only designations. So again, I will just say, when we talk about diverse housing types, we're talking about creating infill, which is another way of saying creating more of these missing middle options throughout the city. And it's literally all of these areas that you see in yellow on the right side of your screen. So again, you can see just how much of our city is currently designated as single family residential zoning.
Jacques, I'm going to ask a question. Oh, can you put that back up? We have a question about the equity map.
Sure.
Will you tell us what the green dots represent? Is it population density or another factor? That's a question from Gia.
Thank you for that question. Let me go back to that slide real quick. So those green dots actually represent different things in different indicator maps, and I don't see the key here. So I actually don't have a good answer for you for right now. I will definitely look into that, and I will type that answer into the text box as soon as I can find that answer for you.
Thanks, Jacques.
But let's get to the reason why we're here, which is to have a conversation with our panelists. So Michaela, Ali, thank you again, and thank you for standing by while I gave that context on the project. I want to start out by asking you both, how do we know that this is a housing crisis? What can you tell us to help us understand that this housing crisis is happening? And Ali, I'd like to start with you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Boy, there are lots of indicators to point that this is a housing crisis on our hand. I'll start at the macro level. As many of us know, the rule of thumb has always been that people shouldn't be spending more than a third of their income on housing. By the sheer average numbers of the city, we know that's a problem, because if the median household income for the city is 62K or so, then the housing should be around 186, the median value of it. And what it is $100,000 above that point, which essentially means that historically what we have done, we have built houses above the price point that people can afford. So that has accumulated across time and generated a significant level of a number of households that are now considered to be housing cost burden. Just to give you an example, or another indicator of that, is that in Pierce County, which is our larger region, half of homeowners would classify as cost burdened. This is massive in terms of low income population, but I want to make sure we understand that when we talk about housing, we're talking about the entire spectrum of income. So that's one side of it. The other side of this, that we know it's a housing crisis, is the way it manifests in rent and rent values. And to the extent to which we have created a rental price structures that also our majority of our workers will have challenges meeting those prices. And we'll talk more about some of the details of this data, but practically all of our service sectors would be challenged with being able to afford our basic fair market rate housing for even for a one-bedroom houses.
Thank you, Ali. Michelle, anything to add about how we know this housing crisis is happening?
Again, let me start with thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited to be on the panel. But I don't think I could say it better than what you both have already explained. I think that it's very apparent that we have a housing crisis. And I think that, a lot of our residents in Tacoma recognize that. And I think that's why when the city was looking at their budgeting process a little earlier this fall, that was a huge thing that stood out, is put more focus on our housing problems that are our housing crisis. So I can't say it any better than what you've already said.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I should also just quickly mention that in the Affordable Housing Action Strategy, there's a lot of data that shows the scope of the crisis. And so Ali was talking about how many households are cost burdened. And we should just mention that the economic and health crisis that this pandemic has taken on the community is only making those numbers worse. So the crisis is trending in the wrong direction in terms of how bad it's getting.
Yeah.
But let's shift for a second from understanding that there is a crisis, because I think most of the people on this call probably understand in one way or another that we're experiencing a housing crisis. And let's talk for a little bit about what's causing this housing crisis. So Michelle, I actually want to start with you for our first speaker on this question. What would you say is causing this housing crisis that we're seeing across the city?
I think there are definitely a handful of things that are causing it. The first things that I would say for sure is the lack of a livable wage. I think that it's really difficult as someone who is still going to school and recently graduated. It's really difficult to find a job with a livable wage, even with a four-year degree. So we see a lack of attainable housing, as you said earlier. So it's more difficult for individuals to find housing that they can afford. And when we do find that housing, typically we're spending over 50% of our income on housing. So I definitely think that that's a major part to play in it. And also our increase in population. So Tacoma is booming right now, which is a positive, but it's also a double-edged sword. We have a lack of housing, but we have more individuals coming to this area and to this region, and they could be migrating from nearby cities. They could be coming in from different states. We're real popular right now. So, we're feeling that. And I think that we're playing a game of catch up right now with the amount of housing units that we have available. And that's why this conversation is so important, because we need to increase our units in the city, but we also want to keep our town and keep our city, beautiful and make, be the essence of what we love here in Tacoma.
Really well put. Ali, what would you say in terms of what's causing this housing crisis?
The list is long, so let me go through a few of them. Michelle, you're absolutely right. There are a number of reasons that you mentioned. One of them is that we don't have the right supply. and I want to say right supply, meaning housing built at a price level that people can afford it based on the wages we pay. So there's an income housing cost gap that in this region, and particularly in the city of Tacoma, that has become a challenge. I found it astonishing that when you look at certain households, you're talking about people who make $35,000 to $50,000. About half of them are facing that problem. It suggests to me that as the cost has gone up for housing, income has not caught up with it. We have not seen that level. And I'm not talking about minimum wage, I'm talking about income. I'm talking about the same thing that you were talking about, the college graduate facing that kind of challenge. So one of the things is that, why are we building the kind of housing that people who are here can't afford it? So to some level, also I want to point to the fact that housing crisis is a national problem. So I just want to make sure we understand we're not an exception. And it is a national problem because there's a mismatch between the housing supply and what people can afford. There's a second part to this, and that is sometimes the way our land use and zoning is done, it creates that condition where the supply is at a particular type of housing, which keeps the price point high. The more land you have, the bigger houses there are, the higher the prices. So one of the challenges is that who lives here? And if everybody loves this region and they're coming to this region, at what price point they're coming to this region, with what kind of income they're coming to this region, which means the housing is not caught up with the population itself. So it ends up creating this severe condition that gradually a portion of the population that unfortunately tends to be lower income communities of color being pushed out of that housing market gradually, and creating this new form of city in which economic prosperity has brought housing challenges on top of it. And so I just want to make sure we understand the duality of that. With economic prosperity, your eye has to be on, you have to be fixated on the housing issue. And if you're not, then what happens in due time, you lose the market in that direction for affordable housing. The other part of the cause is that regions that are typically in search of economic prosperity tend to not think that housing is a crisis yet, because they think of themselves as an affordable region. And the longer they begin to convince themselves that they are an affordable region compared to their neighboring places, they end up not investing time. Last item that I will say on this is that also this is not just a Tacoma problem, it's a regional problem. Housing cannot be solved by one city and one city only. It requires a coalition of people. So one of the reasons we have this is that we haven't had a bigger conversation outside. The last 2 years have been very promising, but it is important for us to have a regional understanding of what this might do to quality of life for us and who will be here 10 years from now.
Thank you. That was a long list, but like we said, this is a complicated issue, right? The one thing that I would add to that is one of the ways that the housing crisis was explained to me that really resonated was making the analogy to musical chairs. And if you all are familiar with the game of musical chairs, you know, you start with a number of people and there's one less chair than the number of people in the game. And when the music stops, everybody has to find a chair and somebody gets left out, right? And every round, there's an additional chair that gets taken out. Well, if you think about the housing market in a similar way, Michela was talking about population growth, right? And that we're actually growing at a rate faster than the supply of housing that we have. So when you think about housing as those chairs, right, we're adding more people to the game much faster than we're able to add chairs. And so when the music stops, we're seeing more and more people struggling to find a situation that works for them. And that leads to all kinds of impacts in terms of people not being able to stay in Tacoma anymore, people not being able to find housing that meets their particular need. And in a lot of cases, as we're seeing, our houseless residents are becoming more and more numerous because of all the pressures of this game of musical chairs that's really not a game at all. And the additional pressure of the income not going up as fast as housing is going up creates an additional pressure point, right? And so for those of you that may be economists or familiar with economist's way of thinking, there's a supply and demand curve that's happening, right? And as supply does not grow at the rate of demand, you see prices start to rise much more quickly. And that's part of what we're seeing, is that supply is not meeting demand, and so you have prices rising really quickly. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A that kind of speak to that, about, is this happening for homeowners more than renters? And my quick answer, and I'll pass it to you, Ali, since you know so much more about this than I do, but my quick answer is, from what I know, it's happening for everybody. That we see some of the fastest rates of rising rents and some of the fastest rates of rising home costs in the country, in our region. And literally more than 10% year-over-year growth in both housing costs and rents, which far, far outpaces any income growth. But Ali, what would you add to that?
Well, basically, it's for both population. I think for renters, it's about the same rate as the homeowners, which is kind of surprising for City of Tacoma to think about it. However, what is interesting about this is that as the supply for rent also diminishes compared to the demand that exists for that, it becomes a challenge. So for renter population is even more dire, because the supply of rental units may not be adequate in that sense. So what I would look at is, I encourage all of us to look at fair market rate that has been established for Pierce County. And last year I did take a look at our region to see what kind of income we have and what kind of FMRs we have. And in reality, there are very few jobs in the lower part of our income that can afford our basic level of rental units. And we are talking about specifically renters. And some of these professions are the kind of professions we need this in this region. And if we displace that population, I'm not quite sure how we would support the kind of quality of life that we expect. And that's why I think we need to think about housing not as a household problem, but as a collective problem. It's all of our problems. And to your point, Jacques, if we look at Pierce County, and I'm going to use Pierce County as an indicator for us, because I want to think regions for a second. If income has increased over the last 10 years, between 10 to 15 percentage points, and housing has gone up over 100% in price, you can right there see the dilemma that we have. Not only we have not built enough, we have created a condition that gradually no one can catch up with the housing price that's going there. So who bids on the houses? Who can afford it?
Absolutely. Well, let's take a deeper dive into some of those people that you're talking about, Ali. And when I've heard people talk about workforce housing, it's not lowest income people. We're talking about nurses. We're talking about firefighters. We're talking about people that have what we would consider stable, decent paying jobs that are struggling to find housing options that they can afford. But there's also a crisis happening for lower income folks, right? And that the most pressure that's being felt is amongst our lowest income residents. And I'm wondering, Michela, starting with you, what does this actually mean and look like for Tacoma residents?
I think what comes to mind when you ask is, I've been helping my organization with our ERAP programming. So that's Emergency Rental Assistance Programming. And we've seen hundreds of people, need assistance, especially during the pandemic, with folks being laid off or unemployed at the highest rates we've seen in my lifetime. And so just what we see is a large amount of people just not being able to, one, find the employment to cover the housing costs, especially if they're spending more than 50% of their income that they do receive on housing. Then we see that, and when we're helping or assisting individuals in the community, when I call someone and tell them that we're able to cover their rent, we're crying on the phone together. This is something that's having not only, it's having an emotional reaction. It's affecting the health of our residents here in Tacoma. Not only are we concerned with a pandemic, but we're also concerned with whether or not we have a roof over our heads. And I think that, in a lot of the work that I do, that's the biggest takeaway for me is this is something that is carrying. We see families, full families, experiencing homelessness right now because of the housing market not being affordable and not being available. And we see discrimination, and I can go on and on. I know we have another question coming up to address that, but I think that there are definitely different areas that we have to look at in addition to housing that people experiencing homelessness or people who are having difficulty paying rent or paying their mortgage are going through right now.
Eviction challenges are on our horizon. That's one of the greatest indications of a housing crisis. You asked the question, so I'm going to throw some numbers at us to sort of think about. In city of Tacoma, households that make less than $20,000 a year, 87% of them before COVID were considered to be a cost-burden household. In other words, people couldn't afford housing properly. And as you begin to go up the income, 20 to 35,000 is about 69%. Going up is 55%, but the lower income population, by and large, means they're mostly in dire need of housing. And so when we think about housing, both for ownership and for rent, I want to encourage us to think about how we bring the prices to the level of our income that we provide, number one. Number two, how do we protect renters? And how do we protect people who are buying their first home in moments of crisis? If there's one thing pandemic has taught us is that the inequities, and I know we're going to get into that, the inequities of our system has now been magnified for us to see it. And we'll get to that separately, I'm sure.
Yeah, Michelle, you brought up the health kind of lens to the impacts that people are feeling from housing. And I just want to kind of explore that for a minute and talk about displacement and the impacts that displacement have on the community and on the individuals themselves. So for those of you that have heard the word displacement but may not be as familiar with it, displacement is when folks essentially get priced out of a neighborhood that they have lived in for a while. And in Tacoma, the example that generally comes right to the top of mind when we talk about displacement is the hilltop. And thinking about what has been our historically Black neighborhood in Tacoma. And the reason that it is the historically Black neighborhood in Tacoma is because our Black residents were literally redlined out of other neighborhoods and sort of funneled into particular areas to live. That area is now becoming more and more desirable, right, for people all over the economic spectrum. And what that does is it raises the price of housing over time. And what we see, especially for people that are on fixed incomes, such as, can think of, the grandma that has been in Hilltop for the past 60 years and is now living on their Social Security check, which does not go up every year. But the property taxes go up every year. The prices of the houses next door go up every year. They are continually put into higher pressure economic situations and forced to make decisions about being able to stay in the community that they've lived in for a long time. And so I will just say that, it's not as easy as saying, well, go find cheaper housing, because what we're seeing is a lot of Tacoma residents that have been here for generations are actually being forced into difficult decisions and ending up, in some cases, moving to outskirt areas like Parkland Spanaway, where you can potentially find cheaper housing. But that comes at a cost, right? It's not as simple as just saying, I'm going to move my life, because you're talking about a whole network, right, of family and friends, your support system, the neighborhood that you have grown up in and known, your reasons for being are challenged. So I know that displacement is a huge issue that we're dealing with, and just wanted to see if either of you wanted to add anything to that concept as well, in terms of what people are dealing with in their experiences of the housing crisis. Michaela?
Sorry, I tried to hit the mute and I didn't. So I have so many thoughts about displacement, especially I'm one of the newest members on the Hilltop Action Coalition, but I've lived in the neighborhood for a few years now, and I think that I see it so prevalently in my own neighborhood. And it's happened to some of the board members, some of our staff. It's happened to myself. You know, we have to think about apologies. We have to think about what the issue of displacement, I think, was already a huge issue, especially like even if we look at 2019, we saw large conversations about displacement. We saw, and when we see displacement, like you said, in these neighborhoods, particularly of people of color, what we're saying is, okay, move your Black community out of this area so we can move our well-off, particular, usually white neighbors in. You know, and I think that if Tacoma, if we say that we're a welcoming city, we want to be able to support individuals who are already here, our communities that are already here, and welcome new community members. And I think that we really, I appreciate the work that we do because we're able to focus on that and make that in the forefront of our work. Going to school in Seattle, a lot of my classmates will talk about the displacement that's occurring in Seattle at huge rates. And we see, I mean, there's so much going on that we want to protect ourselves and our residents from here in Tacoma, but we see that, and we have residents that come to Hilltop, or they'll contact our board president and they'll tell them what's going on. They'll tell them the issues, the worries that they have. And then if we're thinking about our more seasoned residents, they're going through the possibility of contracting COVID while also trying to figure out if they can keep their roof over their heads. So I just think that we'd have to continue the conversation about displacement. It should come up in all conversations about housing. And I think that showed up when our participants did our poll, you know, keeping individuals in their homes for longer, so that we can continue equity and building, you know, generational wealth. That's a part of it too. There's so much that goes into displacement, and that's why the conversation is so important to continue having, because there's so many aspects to what displacement causes within the community.
Totally. And Ali, before you answer, I think I want to take this opportunity. We're starting to talk about kind of the equity lens being applied to our housing crisis. What would you say if somebody were to ask you, why is this an equity and anti-racism issue?
Well, I think you already started with the redlining. And that essentially means, I would just want us to completely be blunt and understand this. Disinvestment across time in a neighborhood has kept the land value low because it has made it not desirable. So one of the things that's really important is that the racial attitudes and ideologies are built into the map of a city, into the landscape of a city. And the patterns of disinvestment create these sets of undervalued neighborhoods, which then, when we invest public money in to up their value, then the displacement starts. And I just want to give you an example of how that works. And please, as I said, this is a blunt conversation, right? So we want to be transparent about things. So when light rail comes in, one of the things that's going to do is to improve land value, which means essentially it becomes for somebody else. And one of the things that we need to think about, the city should always love the people who have been with it through hard times, not just simply who we can get here to bring more income in. And so one of the housing crises that we always create for ourselves is that we forget the people who are here. And displacement is a way of valuing different people differently. So why is this a racial attitude? Because it's built into it. It's built into the fabric of the city. To be anti-racist is to redo these structural problems that we have. So in many ways, for me, displacement, especially displacement of the communities of color, is an indication that the city has not caught up with its own racial past, right? And so I want us to understand what that means. We hold the light of economic prosperity in generality against displacement of a community, and we just try to see if they're one and the same. We need to do better than that. We need to make sure that when we are getting a community back to a place where investment is important and people come to invest, that the investment is also made in the people who are there. That's what the distinction is. The other part of it is that just looking at the housing data itself, it's clear, as you were saying, who is cost burdened. There's a disproportionate level for the racial and ethnic communities and communities of color as a whole. Historically in the US, the one way they have suffered is through housing, and the fact that because they have no access, they don't have adequate access to housing, intergenerational wealth has been practically nil. For the Black community has always been about zero across generations, and one of them is housing. There is no middle class basis given and provided. And so that's where we need to do better as a city that's dedicated to the idea of equity and social justice. And I'm so glad City of Tacoma is actually thinking about that.
Michela, what would you answer to that question? Why is this an equity and anti-racist issue?
I love the way Ali put it, is that it's built into the way our city is designed. If we're looking at the historic institutional racism of redlining and how it was funded and perpetuated by the Federal Housing Administration, we can see that there was a institutional effort to box in Black and brown folks in certain communities and then not fund them adequately. So there's no question that the way our city is laid out, the fact that our equity map resembles a redlining map, that's by design, you know, and the equity index that was created 3 or 4 years ago, and for it to look like a map that was released in the 40s, that's huge. And I think that's should be at the forefront of the conversation, and along with displacement, because like Ali said, like that's showing that you need to put your money where your mouth is. And I say that a lot for the city because I love that we have our resolution 40622 saying that we are dismantling these anti-racist systems that are prevalent in Tacoma. I think that's important, but as a resident and as a volunteer, as a community member, I want us to put our money where our mouth is. You know, I want us to show up for the community. I want us to recognize that this is racist. We're acknowledging this, and we are going to work towards fixing it. And just to, when we look at those communities, you can find different articles on restrictive covenants. We can find those racist things in some deeds that are still existing today. So we really have to dive into anti-racist work. You know, it's not just a movement. It's not just something that we're going to give up on in 2021. You know, this is not going anywhere, just like Black people. So we're having this conversation and it's not going away.
Hey, Jacques, I'm going to jump in because technically our event is over, but we really want to hear some questions from the audience. And I think the questions from the audience are actually going to speak to what was going to be your last great question. Is that all right, Jacques?
That sounds great, Kenny. Thank you.
And thank you, Ali and Michela. You two are incredible. A lot of these questions are kind of directed at Jacques because the city hosted this event, and I think we all know the city has a big part of the solution. So you two, please jump in whenever you feel like it, but understand that they're kind of right at the city. So Jacques, first question from Laura. Could you discuss changing, and just so you know, even though I'm gonna try to go all the way to 1. So if you can stay, please just stay. If you have to go, we totally understand. We said we'd be done at 12:45. I never agreed to that, and I just think the audience questions are really good. So I'm gonna ask until we run out of time. So Jacques, this is from Laura. Could you discuss changing zoning? This has been done in other cities to expand affordable housing opportunities. And Audra had the same question, like who actually changes zoning laws? Who's in charge of that?
Great question. And the short answer is yes, zoning can be changed. And one main way that you can change zoning is through what's called the city's comprehensive plan. And every year, the comprehensive plan goes through an amendment process where changes are proposed. And the way the process works is that we have a planning commission that proposes changes and amendments to that comprehensive plan that's then approved by council. And this Home in Tacoma project that this conversation is housed under is doing exactly that. We are looking at what potential changes to the zoning would facilitate becoming a more equitable, housing-rich type of environment where everybody in Tacoma can get the type of housing that they need. And if you're interested in following, I would just point you to the Home in Tacoma project page where you can learn more about the zoning changes that and the process.
Cool. And
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead,
I wanted to add something. As someone who is not a planner, okay, it's not my specialty or my strong suit. I think that it takes a lot of effort on behalf of someone who is not in that field to understand what's going on with zoning, how to propose zoning changes and things like that. So that's definitely a barrier, but I encourage all participants to just take the first step. Sometimes it's even hard talking to planners, not gonna lie, no shade. But it is definitely something to look into, because what, just in my experience, what I've seen is that what comes with having generational wealth and having a home over generations, more about zoning. And typically it looks like a lot of white folks who are talking about zoning. So if we're looking to impact underserved communities or people of color, it's really important that the conversation be palatable, but also that we invite them to the table more often.
Yeah, thank you, Michaela. This Home in Tacoma panel series is just the very first baby step of being more accessible for this project. I hope that people have learned from you two and know how open your spirits are. And I think people will ask you questions, and please pass them on to our team. If Jacques and I need to translate to planners, we will, whatever it takes. Ali, this actually is a question that might be in your field. This question from Neil. Has there been any consideration given to directly addressing the state's prohibition against rent controls?
That I think I'm going to have to pass on to Jacques, because that he may know more than I do. Jacques?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we have not gotten any traction there because, like you said in the question, it is under state control, and the issue with that is that even if Tacoma were to feel like that was a potential solution to some of our problems, a lot of other smaller cities absolutely feel the opposite. And so in addition to that, we're not unified in Tacoma about whether that is actually a solution. And so that has not been something that we have gone after.
Okay, I tried to give you one, Ali. You're not getting out of this next one. All right. Can you speak to, this is a multiple part question, one from Diane, and then, Diane wants to know why prices are rising so rapidly. And then Diane and Tony both asked about, is this just a Hilltop problem, or are we seeing this in other parts of town, and what are those parts of town?
Well, the prices going up, I think we already addressed. You have lower levels of supply of a specific kind of housing and a higher demand for it. So the bid for housing goes up. It's just a supply and demand issue. The other problem that we have, or why it causes it, is that we tend to be producing the same kind of houses most of the time. Most of the permits are for a specific kind of housing. So we need more of when we talk about missing middle, we're talking about different kinds of housing type at smaller sizes with lower prices, and not a lot of those are built. And when they're built, they're in such an inadequate supply that immediately the prices goes up. So condos that would have been affordable 5 years ago, now they are not going to be affordable because their prices have gone up in that level. The second part of the question was, can you repeat that?
Other parts of town that we're seeing displacement.
Right now, the major issue is around Hilltop. I think one of the concerns is that the investment, the level of investment in Hilltop around new link and other things is going to, is helping up the price essentially of the land around it. In other parts of the city, it will show up in due time. In other words, there are possibilities, I would call it zones in which we need to watch. There's some on the east side and south side as well. So those are the sort of locations that we could potentially see a shift in investment patterns. One of the things that we need to know also is that typically cities where they have points of, I call it consumption of culture, meaning people go for ethnic flavor and they go for a specific kind of environments, typically eventually brings investment in those places that causes displacement of the very thing that people came to experience. So one of the things that we want to watch for is outside Hilltop. We didn't get to solutions. One of the things that I want us to think about is how do we protect land on behalf of community land trusts, the kind of land banking that can happen around that. But there are a number of other issues that can help us prevent this displacement, but also improve the number of units that are affordable. And if you want, for the remaining amount of time, we can get into that. We have only 5 minutes, though. Sorry.
I think we'll do 2 more questions, and then your closing comments can be how you would solve Tacoma housing crisis in 1 minute. I think you can both. I think you can do it. All right. Next question is from Kimber. Jacques, is there a part of the affordable housing action strategy to make underutilized municipal land available to build low income or affordable housing on? I think Ali likes this one.
Well, that's a direct tie into what he was just saying. How do we protect land for housing? And yes, there is a part of the AHAs that talks about that. And it is really one of the things that I would point to as a success, because affordable housing is a top tier use for those land uses now. And so every parcel of land that goes up as potentially surplus land now has affordable housing as the top tier use in its designation.
Quick question from Al. Describe the racial ethnic composition of the Planning Commission. I can do this. There are 3 people of color currently. I don't believe there are any Black members of the Planning Commission. If people are interested in that, there isn't an opening, but I would love to connect you with those folks and help make that happen. Last question is from Michael Mira. Hi, Michael. Ali has described the public costs that result when large parts of the community do not have adequate or affordable housing. Is it possible to put a price tag on that cost? Knowing that price would help justify the public investment the solution to the housing problem will require.
Jacques, that goes to you.
Yeah, I mean, we could look at all of the impacts and try to price out what the public cost is, and it would be significant. So the answer is yes. It all depends on how you would calculate that. Ali, what would you say?
Well, I think there's a systematic problem here. Public investment for private gain has been a part of the legacy of American cities. We build roads and companies benefit from it, but there is no payment back to that system. So I think a systematic assessment of differential level of investment has to be understood, that the level of investment that we are making in a particular type of service to Hilltop, the benefit of that needs to be turned into community side as opposed to private land ownership side. So what we need to do, and it's not a complicated brain surgery to figure out what is the total net public investment and how that should be passed on, and how that should not be given back to the community to take care of. The communities of color who live in these neighborhoods need to be protected against that, because that's where the differential is. The benefit is not going to them, it's going to the future investors.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to give you time for closing comments. But before we get to that, I'm going to throw my email in the chat. If there's a question that we didn't get to, but you would like follow-up on, I'm going to pass them on to our planning department. Elliot is leading the Home in Tacoma project, Elliot Barnett. And then just if you have any questions or feedback about this series, or if you just need help connecting to the next ones, we're going to do 2 more of these. And then there's going to be a lot of opportunity for public feedback and public involvement in the Home in Tacoma project. So we need all of you to be part of this. And as we close, will you just give your closing thoughts, and especially if you have any solution ideas that the Home in Tacoma team needs to know, Will you throw those out there? We'll do Michaela, then Ali, and then Jock, will you just give us an official goodbye? And if you have any solutions you want to throw in there too. Thank you. Michaela?
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this series. I'm super excited that I was able to participate and listen and learn. I think you said something about a solution. Honestly, if I had one, we'd be golden. But, I think a big role that I play on the Human Rights Commission and in partnership with the Planning Commission is just engagement. I think that there are always opportunities to engage the community in different ways, in better ways. And I know that it's super challenging to try and do that during a pandemic, but, I think I appreciate our creativity. I know this is the first time the city has done something like this. And I want us to continue doing that. And that is something that I will always continue advocating for, is reaching out to communities and following up with communities, not just asking our communities of color and our underserved communities what they need and not returning and telling them, giving them an update, asking them, what else do you need? So I think that is the beginning steps to solving some issues.
Well, I think I'll start by saying that while some of us, those at least here talking, may know through their own interactions about the challenges that housing is facing and people are facing around housing, it would be good for all of us to learn from those who are facing this challenge, what solutions they would like to see, what kind of support they would like for us to think about. There are a number of issues that other cities and other regions have dealt with, or approaches that they have taken on. One is, I mentioned already, I think we need to begin to seriously think about community land trusts and do some more work around that for the city. We need to incentivize affordable housing development. Again, it's a part of what Jacques was talking about, how city can step into that space. Making public land available for affordable housing is a great start right there. But there are other things that we can do. Establishing commercial linkage fees to fund affordable housing development. It's a little tough for people to swallow that, but that's one way that cities have handled that. And one of the toughest one that some cities don't want to hear about, mandatory inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning has done wonders in some places, but there is a milder cousin to that, which is incentive zoning. So if that's what we need to start with, we need to start with that. Mixed income housing. But one of the two things I want to leave us to think about, two items. One is experimenting with different building types at different price points and making that, incentivizing that. And the one thing for specific parts of the city, we need to look at parking requirements. And we need to think about ADUs, but ADUs for affordable housing, not just ADUs for the sake of ADUs. So in some ways, we need to look around. There are regions who have done this. They may not be 100% there. They may not even be 30% there, but they are somewhere out there, and we can begin to learn from them. And thank you for the opportunity.
And I'll just piggyback off of that and say, one of the top things we can do is to unlock the 75% of our city that currently does not have the ability to have these smaller, more affordable types of housing. And so being able to include missing middle housing types is really one of the top ways that we can increase that supply to help meet demand. And I should say, developers are not the enemy in this crisis, right? They are facing increased pressures like higher construction costs, materials costs are rising. It's getting harder and harder to build things that pencil out. And so being able to build these smaller, more affordable units is really a win-win when you think about developers having access to building more types of housing, as well as people being able to have access to more housing opportunities. So I'm really excited about where the Home in Tacoma project is going and what we can possibly do with this. And I want to finish off by thanking Kenny for helping moderate this. But really a huge thank you to Michaela and Ali for sharing your wisdom with us today, helping us better understand this housing crisis and being partners with us in thinking through how we can address the housing crisis for the city. So thank you so much for your for your guidance and wisdom. Again, really appreciated the conversation and looking forward to continuing the conversation with you all in the future. If everybody is feeling like this was a good use of your time, I would really encourage you to come back on January 8th for the next set in this series, where we will be talking about the city's role in creating more affordable housing and dealing with the housing crisis. So we'll get into more of these solutions that we were only able to touch at the very top surface on January 8th. And for more information, please go to the Home in Tacoma page and those links that we put in the chat. But again, thank you all for joining us. We look forward to talking with you more soon.